She arrived in England as a child bride, wrapped in white fur, but she would leave it feared as the she-wolf of France. Our story begins on an ice-slick winter morning in 1308 and races through secret alliances, forbidden love, brutal executions, and a coup that changed the crown of England forever. Isabella of France faced a distant husband, a reckless favorite, famine, war, and betrayal, and answered each blow with a colder, sharper move of her own. She toppled a king, ruled a kingdom, gambled her heart on a fugitive lord, and watched her own son turn against her for the sake of the throne. Was she a heroic survivor or a ruthless conspirator? We follow the money, the murders, and the medieval power plays to find out. If you crave royal intrigue, courtroom drama, and the raw truth behind one of Europe's most notorious queens, keep watching. Because Isabella's saga proves that in the Middle Ages, a crown could be as deadly as any sword. Isabella of France was born in either late 1295 or early 1296, when the Seine froze hard enough for ox carts to cross. Parisian winters could be brutal, and the royal nursery at the Louvre Palace felt colder still under the gaze of King Philip IV, a monarch so handsome troubadours called him Le Bel, yet so unemotional diplomats swore his veins carried ice. Isabella's first memories were framed by ribbons of incense drifting through stone corridors, by the clang of armor outside council chambers, and by the hush that fell whenever her father appeared. Queen Joan of Navarre, her mother, provided warmth and the lilting melodies of the Pyrenees while she lived, but Joan died before Isabella turned 6. Gossip insisted Philip had hurried his wife's end to consolidate her lands. The official chroniclers blamed childbirth fever. Either way, the little princess learned that affection could vanish without warning, and that survival depended on alertness. She had 3 older brothers, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each being drilled in statecraft by tutors who taught Latin conjugations in the same breath as siege mathematics. Isabella's own education was scarcely less rigorous. She traced Homeric verses on wax tablets, fenced with buttoned foils, and listened while court clerks rehearsed arguments in Roman law. A Dominican friar instructed her in scholastic logic. A Gascon minstrel walked her through scales on a small harp of maple wood. She could outquote most clerics, yet she also mastered softer arts. How to pause just long enough that listeners leaned in. How to hold silk so its sheen caught candlelight. How to coax grooms and ladies to trade tidbits of information. Capetian France was a shark tank. Isabella learned to glide. Philip IV's reign thundered with events that carved deep grooves in European history. In 1302, he quarreled with Pope Boniface VIII, engineered the infamous Anani slap, and bullied the next pontiff into residing at Avignon. 2 years later, he snuffed out the Knights Templar, arresting whole companies at dawn and torturing them for confessions of heresy that conveniently freed their treasure for the crown. Isabella watched chests of silver carted beneath her windows and listened while burned survivors howled psalms outside Paris's walls. She internalized a brutal equation. Power plus narrative could justify any act. By age 12, she already figured in her father's geopolitical calculations. England and France had squabbled over the Duchy of Aquitaine for generations. Binding the new English king with a French princess looked like insurance. In 1307, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died on campaign, leaving a son perceived as malleable. Philip's envoys offered Isabella's hand, and though Pope Clement needed to ratify the union, second cousins required dispensation. No obstacle proved serious. The Treaty of Boulogne set the dowry at 60,000 livres tournois. in plate and jewels, plus a promise that Philip would mediate future border disputes. Isabella, for her part, would carry the soft power of Capetian prestige across the Channel. On a frost-bitten morning in December 1307, merchants along the Rue Saint-Honoré paused to watch an astonishing convoy: crates of damask, barrels of rosewater, wardrobes packed with zibeline and vair, gilded reliquaries, candelabra, a portable oratory, and 2 circlets of worked gold. Isabella, face hidden behind an ermine-lined hood, rode at the procession center, surrounded by Swiss halberdiers and clerks, tallying every clasp and button for the inventories. She embarked from Calais, her ship rolling through leaden waves, and landed at Dover with salt spray crystallizing on her lashes. London welcomed her in pageant fashion: civic banners, perfumed fountains spilling claret, choirs singing Te Deum under frosted eaves. Yet within minutes she sensed the invisible draft in the hall. Edward II's eyes kept sliding to the flamboyant noble who shadowed his steps. Piers Gaveston wore violet velvet slashed to show cloth of silver, a hat sprouting a heron plume, and a grin that all but crackled with mischief. During the coronation banquet, he sat so close to the throne dais that old earls had to stand. When a minstrel praised Isabella's loveliness in song, Edward leaned sideways, laughing, to translate a bawdy pun privately for Gaveston. The Queen's gilded mouth smiled, though her pulse ticked faster. The political backlash brewed even before the marriage bed cooled. England's baronage, Montfort, de Beauhun, de Clare, resented Gaveston's monopoly on royal charters and offices. Isabella played a deceptively passive role, offering only looks of pained confusion when lords protested at court. But her messengers crossed the Channel with clockwork regularity. Philip IV wrote a thunderous reprimand. How dare an anointed Plantagenet slight a daughter of France? Edward wavered. Parliament smelled blood, and by Easter 1308, Gaveston sailed into exile. His parting gift from the Queen was a belt of pearls whose clasp bore her cipher upside down. He returned the next spring, contrite only to Edward, and soon the kingdom unraveled. Baronial alliances shifted like a board of drafts. First, Lancaster and Warwick led the ordainers, who drafted the ordinances of 1311 to curtail Gaveston. Then Gaveston defied the ban and re-entered England under Edward's wing. Finally, the Earl of Warwick captured him outside Scarborough. On Blacklow Hill, Gaveston died by sword. Whether kneeling or defiant depends on chronicler bias. Isabella, 5 months pregnant and lodged at Woodstock, received the news with controlled composure. A chamberlain later testified she pressed a hand over her unborn child and whispered, "So ends the first lesson." The prince she bore, in November 1312, became Edward of Windsor, a robust infant with a Capetian jawline. His baptism at St. Paul's Cathedral drew crowds who marveled at the Queen's serenity, the King's fragile smiles, and the silver font transported from Canterbury. Over the next decade, she would add 3 more children: John of Eltham, Eleanor of Woodstock, and Joan of the Tower, each birth reinforcing her place in the succession and complicating any thought of dismissing her. England in those years sagged under defeats. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce's schiltrons shattered Edward II's massive host. The Scottish War bled coffers dry and exposed the king's unsound tactics. The Great Famine of 1315-17 blackened wheat in the fields and starved thousands. Scapegoats multiplied. Preachers ranted about sodomy at court. Pamphlets alleged that a changeling occupied the throne. Isabella attended councils, recommended grain imports from Gascony, and personally funded river repairs around Ely to keep supply routes open. Still, her reputation flickered. Half angel of mercy, half conspirator. Then Hugh Despenser the Younger vaulted to dominance. Older chroniclers portray him as snake-lean, with eyes like tapers, and a lust for other men's land. He married Edward's niece Eleanor de Clare, which put him at the center of the royal affinity, and he understood legal nuance well enough to dispossess neighbors under color of clarifying charters. Isabella tried to co-opt him at first, invited him to hawking parties, complimented his mother on piety, but Hugh mistrusted queens. He maneuvered to amputate her revenue streams, blocked grants to her French household, and eventually convinced Edward to confiscate her dower counties of Ponthieu and Montreuil for state security. Baronial revolts sparked in the Welsh marches in 1321, led by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore and Humphrey de Bohun. Isabella, hoping to forestall bloodshed, publicly begged Edward to exile the Despensers. The king complied for 15 weeks, long enough to raise troops, then recalled Hugh and swept through rebel territory with a fury rare even for medieval campaigns. Mortimer surrendered and spent months in the Tower, languishing until a sympathetic warder smuggled him cordials dosed with opiates. Legend says he drugged his guards, scaled the wall with a rope of knotted sheets, and fled to France dressed as a mason. His name would matter later. Despenser's vengeance upon the queen took forms both subtle and vicious. In 1322, he intercepted her retinue on the Scottish border, abandoned her with minimal escort, and watched approvingly while Bruce's raiders attacked. 2 ladies lay dead. Isabella survived by hacking her skirts to ride faster. Back in London, her apartments were searched for treasonous correspondence, her French confessor jailed, her wardrobe slashed by royal order. Most bitter of all, Edward seized her 2 youngest children and placed them in Despenser castles under protective guardianship. The message rang clear. She was queen in name, hostage in fact. Opportunity arrived, cloaked as crisis. When Charles IV, her last surviving brother, seized Aquitaine in 1325, Edward had to negotiate or lose his continental foothold permanently. He dared not go himself. Despenser could not venture abroad without risking assassination. Isabella volunteered, vowing to reconcile nations. She crossed to Boulogne with a modest household, and her son, the heir, officially as honor guard, secretly as bargaining chip. Within weeks, she stood before Charles's throne, draped in widow black, describing herself as wife abused and mother bereft. The French court, already primed to dislike Edward, rallied behind her. Roger Mortimer joined her entourage soon after, bringing money from Lombard bankers and a blueprint for invasion. He had charisma forged in Marcher uncertainty, where the law swung on whoever mustered archers fastest. Isabella conversed with him not in the soft caress of court French, but in clipped Anglo-Norman, bearing strategic graphs of English discontent. To fund their venture, they bartered Prince Edward's hand to Philippa of Hainault, whose dowry included ships and seasoned Flemish pikemen. Chroniclers speculate whether Isabella and Mortimer became lovers at this stage or later. What matters is the synergy between Capetian authority and Marcher audacity. They sailed from Dordrecht in September 1326, 40-plus vessels skirting storms that seemed almost providentially mild. Landing at Orwell, they advanced under banners quartering the French lilies and Plantagenet lions, with the teenage prince riding at the center like sunrise personified. Counties peeled away from Edward II faster than snow off a thatch roof. Londoners rioted against Despenser agents. Bristol surrendered after a fortnight. The elder Hugh Despenser fell from a gallows in his chain-mail tunic, crashing onto dogs that tore strips from his corpse. Isabella watched from horseback, eyes unreadable. The younger Despenser's death at Hereford remains one of medieval England's ghastliest set pieces. He was dragged by 2 horses, hanged but cut down alive, emasculated, eviscerated, and quartered, with fragments shipped to York, Bristol, London, and Dover as warnings. When the head spiked on London Bridge finally blackened, balladeers twisted a popular chanson into verses mocking his greed. Edward II, cold and penniless in Welsh hills, surrendered to avoid similar theater. Parliament deposed him on the 20th of January 1327, citing incurable incompetence. His abdication in favor of 14-year-old Edward of Windsor was punctuated by Isabella's mild bow, the slightest tilt implying triumph. As regent, she impressed even skeptics. She renewed the Truce of Leake with Scotland, slashed household expenditure by 1/3, and with Mortimer, established commissions of oyer and terminer to stabilize law in distraught shires. Wool exports rebounded. The mint at the Tower resumed full coinage. French envoys praised her sensible counsels, and the papal camera purchased English fleece in record amounts. Yet cracks formed. Mortimer styled himself Earl of March, paraded in Tyrian purple, and accumulated castles with greedy speed. The Queen Mother decorated festivals with Italian acrobats and pearls from the Levant. Critics muttered that Despenser tyranny had merely changed costumes. Edward II's existence remained an awkward specter. While he breathed, usurpation could be alleged. Guarded at Berkeley Castle by men loyal to Mortimer's purse, the former king was reported dead on 23 September 1327. The medical accounts spoke of fatal respiratory compression. Legend insists on a red-hot poker inserted rectally to avoid visible wounds. Modern scholarship suggests he may have escaped to Lombardy, but Isabella commissioned a black marble effigy, hosted a state funeral at Gloucester Abbey, and proceeded as though certainty were achieved. For 3 years, the regency resembled a glittering but unstable edifice. Mortimer bullied juries, executed Marcher rivals without trial, and pushed a treaty in 1328 that ceded virtually all disputed lands to Scotland, a move that enraged young Edward III. The king turned 18 in 1330 and resolved to reclaim power. On the 19th of October, he entered Nottingham Castle after curfew via an unguarded tunnel known as the Robin Hood Gate. Mortimer was seized in Isabella's own chambers, while the queen shouted that he was the dear friend of your late father. Edward III's reply, "So he shall answer for it," froze servants in place. Mortimer hanged at Tyburn within a fortnight, his body left for crows. Isabella, spared through a flicker of filial mercy, entered genteel captivity at Windsor. Captivity proved porous. Within 2 years, she relocated to Castle Rising in Norfolk, a moated stronghold surrounded by reed-filled marshes and church spires. There, the Dowager Queen managed a small shadow court, confessors, physicians, a silk woman from Lucca, a cook famed for almond milk custard. She read romances like the Roman de la Rose, embroidered rose and solio badges for grandchildren, and hunted with greyhounds along the sand dunes at low tide. Royal accountants logged her expenses: £20 for lapis beads, £7 for parchment scores of motets, and a startling £200 lent at interest to a consortium exporting wool to Bruges. Far from wasting money, she multiplied it. Religious patronage occupied much of her later life. She endowed a chantry at Castle Rising for daily mass in perpetuity, funded repairs to the leper hospital at Lynn, and sent candles of Chester wax to the relic shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Yet she also kept fragments of splendor, emerald-shaped as pomegranate seeds, an enamel phoenix brooch once worn by Eleanor of Aquitaine, and a psalter illuminated with twining ivy that scholars still dub the Queen Isabella Book of Hours. Guests noted that the dowager never removed her signet ring, a twin-tailed lion flanked by lilies, symbolizing sovereignty straddling two realms. Her relationship with Edward III thawed. She attended the christening of his heir Edward, later famed as the Black Prince, and delighted in rocking the infant so vigorously that courtiers feared for princely digestion. When the king's daughter Joan caught plague in Bordeaux in 1348, Isabella ordered novenas and dispatched physicians versed in Arabic treatises on contagion. She grieved publicly when the girl died, wearing unadorned black for a month, her longest stretch without jewelry since adolescence. Meanwhile, Europe slid into the 100 Years' War, a conflict Isabella inadvertently helped ignite. Edward III based his claim to the French crown on Capetian blood received through her. French jurists countered with Salic law arguments that a woman could neither inherit nor transmit sovereignty. The irony escaped no one. The she-wolf's DNA armed her son, but simultaneously disqualified her gender from formal power. Isabella, asked for comment by a Milanese envoy, shrugged and said, "A crown finds its own head." She passed her 60th year, remarkable longevity for someone who had survived childbirth fevers, border skirmishes, and more than one palace coup. Arthritis nipped her knuckles. Still she practiced lute scales each dusk, fingers faltering only at elaborate trills. In letters to foreign cousins, she reminisced about tilts at Windsor, praised the Black Prince's chivalry, and gently chided her nephew John II of France for overtaxing wine merchants. Ambassadors who visited Castle Rising reported a mind as sharp as ever, dulled only by certain humors of the chest. Those humors worsened in high summer of 1358. Physicians tried syrups of violets and ground pearls. A Franciscan friar applied relic dust from St. Louis. Nothing eased the wet rasp in her lungs. On 21st August, she summoned the clerk of the wardrobe, dictated bequests, rings to granddaughters, books to the Grey Friars Library, 500 marks to finish the spire of Norwich Cathedral, and asked to be laid out in the habit of the Poor Clares. She clasped a simple cross of cypress, reputedly carved in Jerusalem, and slipped into coma before Compline. The storm that rattled oak shutters that night felt like a mirror of the one she arrived in as a bride half a century earlier. Edward III ordered black banners hung on London Bridge and at every Guildhall. Chroniclers recorded that citizens thronged the streets more out of curiosity than sorrow. Her legend had calcified into moral lesson. Ambitious women bring turmoil, yet those who served her spoke of generosity, of coin pressed into the hands of widows, of a spark in conversation that made even battle-scarred captains sit straighter. Her coffin traveled by barge up the Thames draped in plain linen. Beneath the sheets, however, the gold coronet of a Queen of England glinted, an emblem the widowed nun had quietly insisted upon. At the Grey Friars Church she was buried near the heart of London she once ruled. Later, the dissolution under Henry VIII wrecked the friary, scattering bones, but not before antiquaries sketched her alabaster effigy. Delicate cheekbones, folded hands, a calm impossible to square with the chronicles of fires she had lit. Modern historians argue over her culpability in Edward II's murder, over the extent of her affair with Mortimer, over the sincerity of her late life piety. What no scholar disputes is her impact. She reconfigured the model of medieval queenship from consort to political operator, steered a deposition, midwifed a dynasty, and supplied the genealogical fuse for a century of Anglo-French war.